Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for coming. My name is Steve Koh. I'm Associate Professor of Law and R. Gordon Butler Scholar in International Law here at Boston University School of Law. Oh, thank you. Foreign affairs and national security are twin pillars of our American democracy and indeed our global order. When we think about historical conflicts in Iraq or in Vietnam and contemporary issues today, China, Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, we're always asking ourselves the perennial question, who has the authority in foreign policy, national security, and foreign affairs? And the more specific question for today is, how does the US Constitution distribute and allocate such authority? Our speaker today, Professor Harold Hongju Koh, will answer these questions and more as we celebrate and discuss today his new book, The National Security Constitution in the 21st Century, on sale outside. It's my honor to introduce Professor Koh today, someone who needs no introduction. First of all, he needs no introduction to me personally, because he's my uncle. But second of all, he needs no introduction because his reputation really precedes him. He is a scholar, advocate, government official, law school dean. He's currently serving as Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale University, and previously served as the 15th Dean of Yale Law School from 2004 until 2009. At that point, he left Yale Law School to join the Obama administration to be legal advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, which constitutes yet one of many stints that he had serving in the executive branch. He was also Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and had previously served as an attorney in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice during the Reagan administration. So Professor Koh will give some remarks based on the book. We'll have a brief fireside chat and engage in a Q&A. But just before we begin that, I just wanted to flag one other more personal thing. It's very meaningful for me to be introducing my uncle here because I'm thinking of someone else who was not able to be here, my late grandfather, Professor Kwang Lim Koh. He taught here at Boston University in the 1950s. He taught international law, and the story was very personal for him. He lived here in the United States in political exile. He was also a professor, also an international lawyer, but had to live here in political exile because a military coup overthrew the South Korean government that he worked for in the 60s. So I personally am very grateful to Boston University School of Law, and I'm very grateful to my uncle for being here today. Welcome, Professor Harold Hongju Koh.
Thank you, Professor Koh. Thank you, Dean Angela, for being here. I can't tell you how moved I am to be here and to say this is international law with Professor Koh. That was first said here in the fall of 1952. My dad was a doctoral student at Harvard Law School and was interested to do some teaching on the side. And he heard that there was a new president at BU Law School, but the dean's office was vacant. And so he and my mother went to see the president of BU, who was a man named Harold C. Case. And it turned out that the chairman of the board at the time was a man named Howard Selby, who had actually was a member of the board of the college that my mother attended, Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And Howard Selby suggested to Harold C. Case nice things about my family. And as a result, President Case appointed my father to the BU law faculty without the dean doing anything. Those are the days, folks. Anyway, why do I bring this up? Because that same year, my mother started her PhD program in sociology at BU and graduated in 1958. I attended that graduation at the age of 3. When my oldest brother was born, Howard, he was named after Howard Selby, and his son is Steve. And when I was born, they wanted a name that sounded like Howard, so they named me Harold. after Harold C. Case, the president of Boston University. So this is a very deep tie. I was born in Boston. It feels like a homecoming to all of us. And we're thrilled that another Professor Koh is teaching international law here at BU. So think of me as the third generation to do this. This is my dad in his lecturer's office in 1959. That's Steve today. And that's me and Steve a few years ago when he was working in The Hague at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and I was there to argue a case at the International Court of Justice. So we do this iconic picture. We just did an iconic picture a couple of minutes ago, wherever we get a chance to be together. I want to start with 3 yes/no questions which come out of the debate the other night. The first one could be for a high school civics student. Does the Constitution exempt foreign policy from checks and balances? A second, more specific question, if Donald Trump is reelected, on day one, could he terminate all of our international agreements a few seconds after taking the oath by a single tweet? And the third, if Kamala Harris is elected president, could she, in her efforts to support Israel, back into a war in the Middle East without congressional approval against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in the Red Sea, and implicitly against Iran? Now, the answer to all of these questions should be no. But in fact, the way the practice has evolved, we don't know if anything could legally stop this from happening. Now, this book, which you have before you, was written over the course of 38 years. And so there's a personal story how it got written. There's a historical story how our country got here. And there's an ethical story for lawyers, which is how did lawyers create this problem, and what should we now do to fix it? So as Steve mentioned, when I graduated from law school myself, I was a law clerk for 2 years, then I worked in private practice, and then I worked at the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel under Reagan, and then went to teach at Yale. And then something called the Iran-Contra affair happened, and I thought I should write an article about it, which Yale University Press suggested that I turn into a book. And I had to write the book to get tenure. So all I remember was this string of long nights where every night I would get into bed and say to my wife, if I get hit by a bus, make sure the book gets published. I'll tell you, I wrote this book. There was no internet. There was no hard drives. I wrote the whole thing on floppy disks on a green screen. After that, I had 3 more stints in the State Department. First as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, as Steve mentioned, in the Clinton administration, in the Obama administration as legal advisor to the State Department. I spent a lot of time during the Trump administration writing and litigating against Trump in a book called The Trump Administration and International Law. And in 2021, I was asked to come back to the State Department at the start of the administration to be the senior political lawyer in the office I had previously headed before my sabbatical at Oxford. They still don't have a confirmed legal advisor, if you can believe that. And during that period, I was contacted by the Ukrainians and asked to represent them litigating against Russia at the International Court of Justice and the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And I'm in fact going over there on the 20th of September to argue the next round. I should add, because she's here, that Professor Sarah Sherman Stokes, her mother, is someone that I've served with in 3 of these administrations, and she's just an extraordinary public servant, an extraordinary human being, as I know Professor Sherman Stokes is. So what was the thesis of this book? This is the book I wrote back in 1989. I argue that within our Constitution, there's a subset of norms that I call the National Security Constitution, whose basic premise is that national security power is a power shared, so the checks and balances shouldn't stop at the water's edge. And this is both a policy vision and a constitutional vision, which, if followed, would better promote democracy and reduce the risk of catastrophic outcomes. Now, literally, as I was taking the book over to be published, I said to myself, I shouldn't have included the Iran-Contra affair because I'd like the book to be more timeless. And I thought I would actually reorganize it in a particular way, and I might do that at some point in the future. Anyway, 34 years went by, and as I left the State Department, I thought probably for the last time, and got to Oxford, I had told them I was going to write another book, a different book. And then suddenly I thought, I've been talking about rewriting this book for 34 years. If I'm ever going to do it, now is the time. More than that, and I think the professors will appreciate that, I thought, I'm a tenured professor at a law school, and I served in the US government in 2 different administrations for 4 different administrations over 5 decades, and that may not happen again. So whatever lessons I've learned, I should probably put them down. So what the book does in the first 9 chapters is historical. It goes from the very beginning of the Republic to the rise of the US as a dominant regional power, to become a world hegemon during World War II, then the Cold War in Vietnam and Iran-Contra era, and then the post-Cold War years, Bush 1 and Clinton. But starting in September 11th, 23 years ago yesterday, began an age of terror, and then now a period of new global threats. And during this period, I would argue, a different vision of the National Security Constitution began to take hold, which grips us today. So what's interesting about the book, for somebody reading it for the first time, is that the first 5 chapters here were largely historical, written from the perspective of a constitutional historian. The last 2 chapters are largely autobiographical, because they all concern events with which I was personally involved. Now, the argument is very simple, that the spirit of the National Security Constitution is captured in the famous Steel seizure concurrence of Justice Jackson. Presidential powers are not fixed, but they fluctuate depending on their conjunction with those of Congress. So Congress and the president must agree, and the legality of the president's action should be reviewed by the courts. So all 3 branches should interact. But interestingly, throughout our history, from the very beginning, and to the present, this Youngstown vision has been challenged by a unilateralist vision, that the president can be what Justice Sutherland called the sole organ of our nation in foreign affairs. When I was in the Justice Department in the 1980s, we called this the Curtis Wright, so I'm right site. In other words, if the president's authority was being challenged, we just cite the dicta in that case. And this vision has been now repeated, and you may notice have been endorsed by 6 justices of the Supreme Court just last term in the immunity case. So this has contributed to an unbalancing of institutional participation in foreign affairs, a combination of executive activism, congressional passivity, and judicial tolerance. And it's not just a problem of personalities. I really want to stress this. We may think that everything will be fixed if Kamala Harris is elected president, but this is a problem of structure. And the structural problem is one of synergistic institutional dysfunction. Now, where does the ethical story come in? Lawyers in every administration have tried to protect the US from national security threats. And they've done this by empowering the president and giving the president more freedom to act. And they never had occasion to say cumulatively, what is the impact of this? You could create a president who is himself a national security threat, and you've just empowered him in an extraordinary way. And that came home to us during the first Trump administration. Now, this vision of Youngstown really held sway, to my view, till the end of the 20th century. But in the 21st century, when presidents are strong or proactive, they seize power to act unilaterally. When they are weak or have slim legislative majorities like Biden or Obama, increasingly they are reactively unilateralist. So whether Democrat or Republican, the pendulum keeps moving toward more unilateral executive power, disrupting the original constitutional vision. By the time I got back into the government for the last time, in 2021, it was clear to me that this had gotten out of control. It was as if executive power had been on steroids since September 11th. The power had flowed to the executive and the NSC and the White House. Bill Burns, now the director of the CIA, told me there are more people in military bands than there are in the entire diplomatic service of the US government. But Congress has responded with polarization, politicization, and obstructionism. Legislative process has virtually broken down. Our Speaker of the House had to withdraw a motion or a bill, even to provide stopgap funding beyond October 1st. And the public has come to accept that Congress will do nothing. And more than that, Congress can still block treaties and confirmations. And what that does is it gives the officials who operate unconfirmed absolutely no reason to be loyal to Congress. They've just made their lives miserable. Meanwhile, the courts have relied on a whole series of doctrines to avoid adjudicating these cases. And when they do get to the merits, they uphold the president's power under two theories. One, that even if you're in the third Youngstown category, the lowest ebb, where Congress and the president are acting in opposition, the president can still win. Or statutory Curtis Wright, where they overread a delegated statutory precedent to give the executive branch authority. And when the courts do push back, as they did, for example, in the Guantanamo cases, the executive simply works around those rulings, which is one reason why Guantanamo is still open today, amazingly, years after it should have been closed, and both Obama and Biden said they would close it. This was really brought home when Trump became president. He said, as you know, I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. More recently, he called for the termination of the Constitution. Congress, as you see, has been shockingly subservient, and it's given a historic opportunity to him to appoint a 6-3 Supreme Court majority that will affirm or defer to his initiatives. But this is the important point. Trump has a legal theory that all of his actions are justified by executive unilateralism. Under this theory, legal restraints from within the administration are in violation of the unitary executive, and anything coming from outside is a violation of separation of powers. And this allows him to nullify the rule of law for his own administration. Here are examples that you well know for his first term of his overreach. It reached its zenith in two efforts to steal elections, not one, but two. One, looking the other way while the Russians interfered in electoral outcomes, a quid pro quo in exchange for opposition research about his political rival, and then, of course, January 6th. After he left office, he frustrated congressional oversight by fighting subpoenas. He pardoned all of those convicted. He kept national security information at his house in the bathroom, and then won the most sweeping immunity ruling in history. When I clerked for the Supreme Court in 1982, it was the last immunity ruling, Nixon versus Fitzgerald. It's fair to say not a single person in that building at that time thought that immunity could extend to a former president in the way that the court ruled 6-3 last term. As Sotomayor said in dissent, the president is now a king above the law. But just think about what it holds. One of the things that they hold, Chief Justice Roberts, is that when the president talks to the attorney general, that's immunized. What's the story of Watergate? It's President Nixon talking to Attorney General Mitchell. That's not something that should be immunized. That is the basis of the conspiracy that deserved his being removed from office. And when you read the opinion, which is a shocking opinion, written in a style that suggests that it cares about balance of powers, Chief Justice Roberts is obsessed with the weakening of future presidents while ignoring the lawless president we had and might have again. So increasingly, the president is both responsible and unaccountable, particularly a second-term president. And increasingly, we have a government of people and not laws. And as Joe Biden warned after his first disastrous debate, this makes this a question of character. And we now see that we could easily have a president who has no character. And here's a thought. Trump is not the worst president you could imagine. He's not interested in invading foreign countries, and he's not particularly competent. But you could see we now have Trump 2.0, J.D. Vance, 3.0, Stephen Miller. There will be people who will learn from his example who could take it to the next step. Now, in this saga, just be clear, the president is as much a victim as he is a villain, because they are expected to do everything. The burden of crisis falls on the president. And the message is, even if Kamala Harris wins, we're only one election away from a constitutional disaster. So, as they say in Apollo 13, America, we have a problem. It's a structural dysfunction that has spurred extreme executive unilateralism. And it's not just personalities. Because if we throw out the rascals, throw the rascals out, there will be new rascals. And so it's a structural problem that requires structural fixes, when what has been our tendency has been to ignore the problem or undercorrect. Now, the balance of my book tries to set out a broad strategy of a strong chief executive within a strong system of checks and balances. By the way, for the short version of this yesterday for September 11th on Just Security blog, they're going to do a symposium on my book, and so I wrote the first piece, also building off of the debate. But the broad strategy is to have a mosaic of institutional reforms over the next 30 to 50 years, which would strengthen internal checks and balances in the executive, enact institutional reforms in Congress, particularly a Joint Committee on National Security and a centralized congressional legal advisor, and promote a bunch of doctrines in the judiciary to reduce barriers to judicial oversight. And I won't go through these individually, but they're all in the book. Various internal checks and balances that should be promoted, strengthening the special counsel, recognizing conflicts of interest, revising the Insurrection Act, restraining the first use of nuclear weapons. On the congressional side, requiring congressional role in the withdrawal from key international agreements and a new war powers framework, election security reform, and in the courts, more closely scrutinizing executive justifications for foreign affairs actions. Remember that in the Muslim ban case, Trump claimed that it was because of a national emergency. And of the 10 countries originally mentioned in the Muslim ban, not a single person from those countries had ever committed a lethal crime in the United States, where Saudi Arabia was not on the list. Or Trump had, for example, claimed that the failure of Congress to enact funding to build a wall was a national emergency for which he could use national security power. Now, it's quite ironic because Chief Justice Roberts, in the census case, says we should reject contrived justifications for agency decisions and require that they offer genuine justifications. But then they don't apply it in foreign affairs. But more recently, the court has invoked something essentially entirely ad hoc major questions doctrine, which allows courts to do searching review, notwithstanding the now overruled Chevron doctrine. And in that case, they do allow searching review. They did this in West Virginia versus the United States, which, to my mind, is a climate change case. So this precedent should allow the courts to ask deeper questions than they've asked. Finally, and these are two pet peeves of mine. This is my student, Brett Kavanaugh. You know, I'm not the greatest teacher in the world. What can I say? But when he was nominated to the Supreme Court, he said, I believe in the American rule of law. Well, you know, when I was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, I went to 90 countries. They believe in the rule of law too, Brett. And get this, you say you're an originalist. The originalist justices like John Marshall were internationalists. In fact, John Marshall wrote many more cases under international law than he did under American law because there was no American federal law. If you're an originalist, you should be an internationalist. If you're a nationalist, you're not an originalist. So it's one or the other, Brett. And more than that, here's the greatest irony. 12 of the justices in the last few years, including Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh and Dobbs, all say, we're not going to cite to foreign law. And then when it helps them, they cite to foreign law. So, or just let me take it home even more. I've been to a lot of bar mitzvahs in my life. Everyone you go to, they're dancing to Gangnam Style, which, by the way, I didn't necessarily hear that in Hebrew when I was growing up at Hebrew school. If I go to a taco truck out here on Bay State Road, and I say, could you put some kimchi in my taco? That's what Americans do. We borrow. Americans borrow. And so guess what? Borrowing foreign law is as American as the Frankfurter, the hot dog you eat at Fenway Park, or Apfelkuchen, apple pie that you eat at Fenway Park. So, to me, it is absolutely absurd that in a global era, our justices insist on a nationalist tradition where they do not look to foreign law. Where would it help them? Take, for example, the Brexit case in the UK, where the UK Supreme Court required that the legislature be involved before a final decision could be made for the UK to withdraw from the EU. I'm almost done here. Chapter 11 of the book runs through a bunch of particular areas and suggests how they could be reformed if you're interested in that. I also suggest that particular counterweights to executive power be given more strength. States and localities, media, allies, and private actors. This follows on the themes of my earlier book. And some people have said to me, you know, you could overdo this. The president could be hamstrung. Well, I've been in the government 4 times. In bona fide emergencies, executive power finds a way. I am not worried about the president being hamstrung. There will be a robust response if the president goes and asks for congressional support. So the greater danger by far is undercorrection, not overcorrection. And then finally, the last chapter of the book responds to various objections. Maybe the most pointed is for people who say to me, aren't you one of the people who created this problem? After all, you were a lawyer in some of these cases. When I was in the government, people regularly would cite to me stuff I wrote in articles and say they were inconsistent. They never were. But I often quoted Justice Blackmun, my boss, who said, you know, life is long and you learn things. And if you want to rely on something I wrote in a footnote when I was 28 years old, or something that I write in an opinion for the State Department, when I've been in the government for 40 years and thousands of lives are on the line, I would say, trust me now. But it did bring this to mind. What am I going to do with what I know? Isn't it the job of professors to put down in one place their lessons? Because if somebody says, haven't we had this problem for a while? Why has no one come up with a solution? We can't start thinking about it then. I said, well, maybe what will happen is somebody will say, hey, there's this book. The guy is long gone, or spending all his time watching the Red Sox. But this book has a lot of ideas in it that a congressional staffer could use, that a new presidential candidate could use, or that our government could use. So the challenge is that our national security constitution is seriously off kilter. We need to recognize the urgency of this task. Now, the least convincing thing I heard, and this is the last slide, is our politics will never allow it. This reminds me of the famous joke, how many shrinks does it take to change a light bulb? The light bulb must want to change. I don't think we should assume that our dysfunctional politics will continue forever. In just the last few weeks, both Keir Starmer in the UK and Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention, and again last night or 2 nights ago, said, let's put country over party. If we're going to change, we have to want to change and recognize the problem exists. And I think our alternatives, if you accept my diagnosis, are acceptance, despair, reform now, or reform later. And if you want to reform, the ideas are there. But the key is that we must focus not on America first, but on being Americans first. And if we can't change, let's face it, we'll be stuck with the national security constitution we deserve. So this comes back to you students in Professor Koh's class. I hope you'll take this opportunity to think about these problems and decide, do we want checks and balances to apply at the water's edge? Do I want to be the soldier who gets sent to a new war in the Middle East? Do I want to be the person when NATO is abolished because our president pulled us out based on a tweet? And if you don't want that, it's your responsibility to make the difference. So let me stop there and I'll come on in.
So thank you so much for those remarks, and congratulations on releasing this updated version of the book. I can say for myself, having read it all the way through, I mean, it's truly amazing how you intertwine your personal experience in government with your scholarly perspectives, and it's truly comprehensive story that you're telling. So the first question I had after I put the book down was to think about this question of contingency versus inevitability. So the story that you just told us here and the story you tell in the book is one of a kind of shift from a Youngstown vision to a Curtis Wright vision. And sometimes there's a quality in the book, oh, hello everyone. Sometimes there's a quality in the book wherein it seems as if the movement towards the executive branch is inevitable. So for example, you talk about congressional acquiescence. The reason why Congress acquiesces many of the times is because they're regionally represented, they're diffuse. At the same time, we can imagine another universe in which LBJ prosecuted the Vietnam War differently, wherein Curtis Wright was decided differently. So how do you think about that tension between contingency and inevitability?
Yeah, I think we assume that our Constitution runs on cycles. And so there'll be a cycle back. And certainly Youngstown was an example of that. It was at the end of an unpopular, undeclared war, unpopular president, Harry Truman, and he went one step too far, seizing the steel mills, which had all kinds of other implications. Mm-hmm. After Vietnam and Watergate, we had a new Congress in 1994, and they passed a whole series of laws to restrain the conduct of foreign affairs. The War Powers Resolution, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Intelligence Oversight Act, the Arms Export Control Act, and on and on. What has stopped happening, though, is that Congress can organize itself to respond. So that's problem number one. Let me ask you this question. Why should Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene participate in delicate foreign affairs decisions? Now, it used to be that there was a centralized foreign affairs legislative group that made these kinds of decisions. And these fringe voters didn't have the kind of influence that they do now. And it was then common that key senators like J. William Fulbright or Arthur Vandenberg, or later on Hillary Clinton or John Kerry, could become the Secretary of State. Now, in the tax area, we have a joint committee on taxation, which is bipartisan, which treats these decisions as something that ought to be in the national interest. I mean, you heard the other night, Donald Trump will not commit to protecting Ukraine. His basic answer, when asked repeatedly, was, you know, let Putin do what he wants. To which Kamala Harris correctly pointed out, then Vladimir Putin is going to be sitting in Kyiv. Is that what you people want? Now, Congress has to organize itself better. Another thing is Congress needs a legal advisor. What's happening is these executive branch lawyers, and I was one, issue these opinions, which are like briefs serving the president, and Congress doesn't issue a counter legal opinion. It's not an adversary process. And then we have the problem of the courts. What Trump showed all of us is if you're really single-minded and just keep appointing these people, you can get a permanent majority for a certain set of very extreme positions. And Biden has at least responded to that by trying to focus on judicial appointments, which frankly Biden did not do enough of. Take a look at the immunity decision. You know, two of the judges on the immunity decision, Alito and Thomas, had no business sitting on the case. Let's face it, just as a matter of basic recusal policy. If it had gone to the swing votes, it would have been the opinion of Amy Coney Barrett, which was actually quite nuanced compared to the extreme views that were represented in the majority's decision. So what we need is restraint on all three sides. And finally, there is the role of the executive branch career people. When I got into the Biden administration, I was the only political appointee. I was driving to Washington, and I get a call from a young lawyer I had worked with, and he said, we have a group of lawyers here, career lawyers, who have been very upset about the rule of law in the Trump administration, and they want to talk to you. We often have a Zoom meeting at night. Would you be on the Zoom meeting tonight? And I said, you know, I'm going to be on the New Jersey Turnpike. And we set a time. I pull off into a McDonald's so I can pick up their Wi-Fi. I pull up my iPad, and 300 people got on the Zoom call. And I said, who are you guys? And they say, well, we're the career lawyers and other people at the State Department who have been pushing back against Trump's various initiatives. I said, what do you call yourself? And they said, Deep State. Now, you know, make no mistake, the Trump administration has gotten wise. That's why Project 2025 and other things propose that this sort of widespread sacking of all of these people. But this is an important restraining force. And what I'm just saying is that these restraining forces need to be reinforced. I mean, Merrick Garland is a friend of mine. He's a good guy. He's a man of tremendous integrity. I think he's been too slow in bringing these cases. You know, enough people told him at the start of the administration, you will be defined by how you handled these cases, particularly the January 6 cases. You don't want to be known for prosecuting the lower downs and not the higher ups. And so if you're going to make a decision to bring those cases, bring them so you can finish them. And I also heard, Steve, sorry, this is an amazing story, but I have to tell you, I went to the New Orleans Book Festival, and a journalist was there who covers Congress. And he said on the night of January 6th, 2 o'clock in the morning, after they had voted Biden through, he decides he's going to leave the building by going to the elevator where Mitch McConnell often rides up and down. And he gets on, and who gets on but Mitch McConnell and his staffer. And Mitch McConnell, he says to him, "How do you feel?" And McConnell said, "That son of a," he didn't say son of a gun, "that son of a gun is done. We finished him. He'll never be anything again." And it was clear he just hated him. And he said, "He'll never come back now." Well, a week later they had a decision. Do you prosecute, does the Senate vote and confirm the impeachment? Which 10 Republicans voted for, in which case Trump would have been legally barred from serving. Mitch McConnell, because he was acting in political interest first, pushed this till after Biden's inauguration, killed the Senate impeachment, and when Trump claimed the nomination again, he endorsed him. And now he's leaving office. I mean, that's what happens when people of zero integrity are operating these positions. Obviously contrast that to people like, Lynn Cheney, and, suddenly I'm a fan of Dick Cheney, Mr. Rule of Law. On the day he made his announcement, they actually literally had on MSNBC, "Hell freezes over."
I mean, having been in college during the Iraq War, I never thought we'd be having this conversation about Dick Cheney, Now, so many of these lessons that you've been talking about are really internal. But another thing that comes out in the book is so much of it is responsive to external events in the world. So as you look ahead to November, but then also look ahead to the next administration, whether it's a Harris or a Trump administration, what are the trend lines in the world that make you most concerned about our national security policy and our national security constitution?
Yes, and I'm glad you picked that up. The theme of the chapters is international regimes and constitutional regimes. That these constitutional regimes come under pressure because of the particular role of the United States in the world. I think the obvious challenges right now are Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, the next pandemic. It could be monkeypox, climate change, and artificial intelligence. But let's take a good example. Suppose Kamala Harris is elected president. The United States has been engaging in various kinds of military action along 4 or 5 different streams in the Middle East, supporting Israel against Hamas, supporting Israel against Hezbollah, actions against various Iranian-backed militias, wherever they may be, and then a coalition to try to combat attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea. And Jake Sullivan, who's my student and friend, said, "Is this a Middle East World War III?" And he said, "No, it's strands of activity that we're trying to keep each on their own track." Well, that's a good aspiration, but can the president prevent these streams from merging? And why doesn't Kamala Harris, following the proposals I have here, put legislation on the first day to Congress saying, I want limited authority to use military force for certain kinds of reasons, and also to provide equipment and materiel for a period of 2 years with regular consulting and reporting requirements, and I want to put on a fast-track legislative process where this bill will be voted up or down with no amendments in 90 days. It could be her first act as president, which you hopefully would be at the height of her power. If they vote it, she's got the country on her side. If they don't vote it, it's all on her. And when the body bags start coming home, then that's when the next candidate on the other side is going to rise up and start attacking her. And then it's too late for her to get... In other words, the constitutional process we have is cumbersome to use, which is, as a matter of expedience, why executives consistently dispense with it. But as we saw in Vietnam and elsewhere, it just comes back to haunt them.
Wonderful. So I just have one more question, then we're going to open it up to the floor. And I know I speak for everyone when I say we especially want to hear from the students to ask some questions. So here at Boston University School of Law, all the faculty and staff are very proud of our students, our current students and our alumni. And I know there are many students here in the room today who are thinking about a future working in the international system, working for the US government in the executive branch or any of the branches, clerking. I was wondering just what sort of advice do you have for students usually who are interested in foreign affairs, interested in national security, and want to make a career in that future?
When I was a junior in college, I was taking a foreign policy course as part of a poli-sci major, and the professor said, Henry Kissinger is a scholar diplomat. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, it's somebody who has tenure at a university, but also goes back and forth into the government. He's kind of an in and outer. And I said, why would you do that? He said, well, you have a job, which is in the academy, but you go out into the government and you serve for a little while, and so you get exposed to the real world, and then you go back into the academy and get more big ideas. So I wrote a paper on this, and I thought, you know, that would be fun if I could do it. I then decided I'd like to go to the government 3 times. Once when I'm young, just to see how it works. Once when I'm older, so I can participate in the decision making, and once at a more senior position, where I could be in the room where it happens. And I've actually been there 4 times, so that's more than I expected. I can't tell you how much I learned every single time. You know, I'll give you this example. I go to the Justice Department in the Reagan administration. The second day I'm there at the Justice Department, I'm called to a meeting, and in walks the Attorney General, Edwin Meese. And he starts talking. And I was just amazed. I'm in the room with the Attorney General in a decision-making meeting. Then a couple of minutes later, I realized he's an idiot. He may be your uncle, so I apologize if that's the case. He didn't have a legal bone in his body. He did not think about any issue from the perspective of a lawyer. You know, they asked something about Congress, and his first thing was, which senator do we get to? Not, what is the legal reason why our position is correct? This was such an illuminating thing to me. And I have to tell one more story, just so you know. I was working at the Office of Legal Counsel about a week after we got back from our honeymoon, and I get a call from the White House counsel's office, the assistant White House counsel who was my point of contact, my law school contemporary, John Roberts, now Chief Justice of the United States. And he says, the president is giving a press conference tonight, President Reagan, and could you say something about how much Congress has restrained the president in foreign affairs? Please fax it over to me and put it in the president's voice. So I go to the library in the Justice Department. I find this book that says Congress has passed 550 laws restraining presidential power in foreign affairs in the Watergate Vietnam era. And I type it up, but I remember what Robert said, so I put, well, Congress about. So I go home. I fax it to Roberts, I go home. And we're eating dinner, and my wife says, what'd you do today? And I turn on the TV, and there's Reagan at the end of the press conference, and they ask him a question about the Soviet Union, and he literally goes, well? Congress has passed 550 laws. And I gave my wife the piece of paper, and she said, he's an actor. He memorized his line. It had nothing to do with the question he was asked. But then in the post-conference commentary, they suddenly say, I think his most coherent answer was the one about foreign policy. You have to have these kinds of experiences. And then also, just on the other, I've told you stories that are not good, but on the other side, you see stories of unbelievable courage by people deeply committed to the rule of law. You know, we're approaching a government shutdown. When I was in the State Department, my wife calls me and says, you gotta call Jane, a neighbor of ours. And I call her, and she says, my daughter is a journalist, and she's just been captured in Libya. And we think she might be killed, but can you try to find her? For the next 4 months, every day I called her at night, tell her what leads we had or didn't have. And we finally got a lead. You know, she had broken her glasses when she was captured, and she had studied in Iceland. And a Turkish journalist says, I was in a truck with a young American who couldn't see, who kept talking about Iceland. So we said, we're very close. We actually sent a note to NATO, do not bomb on the road from Benghazi to Tripoli. And then suddenly we get this note. They're going to shut down the government. And I had to go into a meeting of 10 people as legal advisor and read them a message which said, if you continue to work on this during the shutdown with your government equipment, you will be prosecuted. And they said, let them arrest us. We're working here. This woman we're about to get her. You know, who are these people? You know, let's be serious. This is a matter of life or death. And they said, okay, we got your message received. We're just going to continue as usual. And they just took out their own cell phones and just started, and she got out. Anyway, she's successfully got out. Remarkably, the guy who got out with her, James Foley, immediately went back in and was beheaded. So this is a serious business, and people in the government do just show unbelievable commitment. And when I listen to politicians trashing people in our government, I just think if you could spend a minute there, maybe you would have a different view.
I completely agree with that, and I know that's something we'll be talking about more in our international law classes, the importance of public service and really understanding how law works in the world domestically, internationally, and at the intersection of the domestic and international legal system. That firsthand experiential component is just cannot be beaten. So with that,
Steve, let me
oh yeah, of course, yeah.
I went to work for a big firm, and I just finished clerking at the DC Circuit, and a very pompous partner comes in and says, well, they're going to do this, and they're going to do this. And I was the youngest guy at the meeting, and I suddenly said, they don't do it that way. And there's this silence. You know, I'm challenging the big partner. And he says, what? I said, they don't do it that way anymore. Because that's how they did it when I was there. And I said, I left there 3 months ago. They stopped doing it. They don't do it that way anymore. And, you know, you were there. So, you know, it breaks through hierarchy. You're on the ground. Sorry.
No, that's right. I mean, that's a good example. That's real legal knowledge. You know. Okay, we have about 20 minutes, and so let's open up the floor. I'm going to give my microphone to Elizabeth, and my uncle will keep his. And in particular, if there are any students that want to get the ball rolling, feel free to raise your hand. But of course, faculty and staff as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Koh, for your lecture. Really enjoyed it. Just want to ask a question about, from the perspective of people outside of the U.S., you know, the question always arises, who really wields U.S. hard power, right? You know, if you are somewhere in Afghanistan or Iraq, the perspective is that you know, there are 4 sources of American power: White House, Congress, Pentagon, and Langley. And really, if you look at like a place like Afghanistan, from, you know, Bush went in, Obama continued, Trump negotiated with the Taliban, and then eventually Biden withdrew. Maybe the question that people ask is that maybe the focus on White House and Congress is like sort of like, you know, mysterious, and really the people who wield American hard power are the generals in Pentagon and the spies in Langley. So, you know, in that sense, what is your response to that? And there's obviously a dissonance between how Americans perceive the U.S., you know, power operating from a democratic perspective, and how foreigners, you know, see actually people in camo and spies and generals. really wielding power? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's a good question. And look, the alternative to war is diplomacy. And diplomacy gets run out of the State Department and the foreign affairs agencies. In the military and in the intel world, you know, if what you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it is literally true. I attended a conference with a bunch of guys my age who were generals. And they said to me, I kid you not, we have not had a year since we were adults when our budget did not grow by 20% a year. There is no executive in the world who has that kind of guaranteed increase in budget, which leads to astonishing waste and astonishing redundancy and astonishing willingness to use these weapons. You know, we would have meetings in which we would be discussing the legality of hitting certain drone targets. And one of the guys said to me, "You're the guy who takes our targets." And I said, "I like to think I'm the guy who tells you who it's legal for the US to use its lethal power against, because if it's illegal, you're a murderer." Now, the White House is a different story, because every White House, they try to shrink the White House, and then they expand it. So the Biden White House was a very good example. You know, what everybody now forgets is that Joe Biden, you don't remember much about Joe Biden's campaign because it was all on Zoom. You know, Joe Biden basically, his rallies and events were either in Delaware or Philadelphia. He had a very good transition during the day. He raised money at night on Zoom calls that went until 2 or 3 in the morning because he could be on from his home in Delaware. And then we were all sworn in on January 2021 on Zoom. And most of the people weren't there, except at the White House. And at the White House, they triple vaccinated everybody. You had to be tested 3 times a day with different bracelets. So in the White House, 100% of the people were there. At the State Department, they had a 25% occupancy rule where no more than 25% of the staff could swipe in a day. So when I would go to the State Department, it was like a ghost town. Now in that kind of setting, if you've got 300 people working on these issues at the National Security Council and nobody's home at the White House and everybody's doing everything on Zoom, the White House is going to take over the diplomatic negotiations. And especially if our nominated officials aren't getting confirmed for a year for absolutely no reason. So I think that this is essentially what's happened. Now, what you have to do, just be a lawyer. Just be a lawyer. Let me give you this example, if you don't mind. A member of Al-Qaeda was captured boarding a ferry to cross from one part of a country to another, and he was carrying a laptop. And we have a very high-level meeting about it, and the Defense Department guys say, "We don't think this case could be prosecuted in a domestic court. He should go to a military commission." And they say, "Well, what does the Justice Department think about that?" And they said, "We concur. He should go to a military commission." And there was a moment of silence, and I'm from the State Department. And I said, "Are you crazy? Did you say he has a laptop?" And they said, "Well, you know, we don't want to vouch for the way he was treated. His oral testimony might be excluded." I said, "Was he in the possession of the laptop when he was captured? Can you associate him with the laptop?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "The laptop comes in. All the plots on the laptop. You don't need his testimony." I said, you don't think they can prosecute and win this case in the Southern District of New York with the U.S. Attorney's Office? They've never lost. What is this? And then suddenly it was all exposed, and the Defense Department and DOJ had previously agreed that neither one of them wanted to handle this case. They wanted to send it to the military commissions. But we got a little bit of leverage, and the whole thing got exploded. And he got tried in an Article III court. He pleaded guilty, and he's in jail. But that's where you just say, hey, I'm a lawyer. I'm not going to back off just because someone's making some ridiculous statement. I've tried cases. You don't think I could try that case? You have to do this.
Hi, thanks for being here. This has been fabulous. I'm Jessica Silby.
Oh, yeah, I know you well. I know you well.
Well, now I'm nervous. I teach con law and intellectual property for the folks in the room who don't yet know me. And my question's about your comment about AI. You mentioned a bunch of things which I can clearly understand are future worries. And I wanted to invite you to say something more about why AI was on the list of climate change and all the other things.
Thank you. Just to jump ahead, artificial intelligence is inconsistent with Nuremberg. Why is that so? Before Nuremberg, if somebody got killed as part of a genocide or a war crime, they would say, I was just following orders. And then the person who ordered it would say, I didn't know what they were doing. So everybody got exonerated. At Nuremberg, they said everybody is accountable up and down the chain. And therefore, someone would be held responsible. That's the basis of the international criminal work that Steve did at The Hague. Algorithms are not accountable in the same way. If you have a lethal autonomous weapon that kills somebody through a bad set of commands, we don't know if it came from the programmer, from the person who loaded it onto the machine, to the drone operator, to the person on the field who deployed it. And they can all say, as they say, Shaggy, it wasn't me. And as a result, you end up with zero accountability. Now, that's in addition to the fact that AI involves weighing people's lives. In a Tesla, I learned this with great interest. The guys who designed the Tesla value human lives inside the car more than human lives outside the car. Because if they didn't do that, no one would buy a Tesla. But who are they? Who gave them this godlike power? And, people tell you, I was at a conference with a guy, and he was talking about this programmer, how perfectible AI was. And I said, I'm sorry, but I couldn't hear you because I was just checking my autocorrect. We all know that AI makes constant mistakes that have to be overridden by human beings. Steve gave me a parking pass, or got me a parking pass. I had to get GPS, and I get here, and the GPS is sending me off into the middle of the Charles River. And just like Luke in Star Wars, I put down my computer as I've lived in Boston for much of my life when I got there. But it's true that we essentially need a human oversight before things are turned over. And at the moment of the last clear chance, before lethal activity is undertaken, there has to be a moment of accountable human judgment. Now, here's a depressing thought. You can't imagine a more inhumane commander-in-chief than Vladimir Putin. And last time I checked, he's not a robot. He kind of looks like it sometimes. But it doesn't ensure humanity that you have humans in the loop. But we can't allow there to be lethal autonomous weapons that are not subject to these controls. And one of the gimmicks that's being employed is that they call these laws, lethal autonomous weapons systems, which is a scam, because the question is, are the systems that are designing that are autonomous in fact lawful? That's an open question, and that should be subject to an international treaty. In fact, there's an effort to create an international treaty. It's being led by the Austrians. The Germans are the big holdouts. Next month, I'll actually be speaking at a conference designed to sort of persuade the Germans to push for a hard rule of oversight of the last human decision before a lethal targeting decision is made.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions, hopefully. Yeah, Brian or
Thanks, Professor Koh, for your talk. It was wonderful. I was thinking about one of the things that you talked about in terms of the constitutional mechanism that we have in the United States being too cumbersome to always sort of follow by the letter, and so the president finds workarounds. And this, I was thinking about this also from an international perspective in terms of typically, I mean, in the European context, you have a lot of countries that have signed the European Charter of Human Rights, for instance, and yet do these sorts of border offshoring to North African countries, which end up handling their migration crisis for them, oftentimes in places like Libya or Mali, with horrible human rights abuses getting perpetrated against these migrants. And I wonder if this is sort of just kind of a legal fiction, the sort of adherence to international law as you would see it. I'm curious about your thoughts, or if in fact, right, I guess is the executive power there as similar? Would you diagnose it similarly in terms of another cumbersome supranational legal tool that executives from the European Union and then also from Southern European states are just finding workarounds for?
I think you make an important point, which is legislative input or judicial oversight. Often the analogy on the international level is allied participation, right? So if you're operating through NATO and NATO has to agree how far you're going to go, that's a check and balance, even if it's not a constitutional check and balance. So for example, you know, in US drone practice, in a NATO facility, you'll actually have a drone operator. And this is depicted in movies, but often inaccurately. And the American drone operator, who might be sitting in Nevada or somewhere, if they're operating in NATO territory, they have a European person sitting next to them. And they have to make the case to that person as to why the strike is legal. And that person radios to their commander as to whether or not they should validate the strike. And if not, they literally have a red card, like you do in soccer. They pull out the red card and they say, you can't do the strike. And that only has to happen once a year for everybody to be very careful about whether they're going to do a strike loosely or not. This is one reason why I mentioned the value of foreign law in these kinds of matters, because foreign interference, because foreign check and balance, because it plays an incredibly important role. Let me give you another example, which would be funny if it wasn't so ridiculous. You know, the Obama administration decided that they would look into the question of whether to eliminate don't ask, don't tell, and let LGBT soldiers openly enlist. So typical of the Defense Department in this system of ludicrous military resources commissioned a study which ended up costing $7 million to discuss the role of LGBT soldiers in the American military. So as part of this, we had a meeting of the NATO legal advisors, defense and state, in Florida. And I suggested that we have the NATO legal advisors and ask them, what is the role of LGBT soldiers in your force? So I started, and by the way, we had the the General Counsel of the Department of Defense and the General Counsel of the Joint Chiefs of Staff there. And they were saying, you know, this is very disruptive. Having gay soldiers might disrupt unit cohesion. And they had a whole bunch of tropes that they were raising. So I said, maybe we can start with the German legal advisor. And he says, well, you know, we didn't have any gays in the military in Germany until 1969, and we admitted them, and it took about 6 months to get them all acclimated. Now it's fine. At which point, the General Counsel of the US Department of Defense says, what about unit cohesion? And the German guy goes, well, you know, US soldiers serve with NATO forces. So American soldiers have been serving with gay Germans for the last 30 years. And I haven't noticed any problems with those units' cohesion. And he goes, by the way, our defense minister is gay, and I'm gay. You know, that's the kind of thing that you get when you have comparative legal experience, is that these myths that are being asserted, remember that in constitutional law we say compelling state interest, and that the facts, the terms of the legal restraint are necessary to serve the compelling state interest. It turns out there was no problem with unit cohesion. You know, same thing was said, you know, are gay parents good parents? Well, turns out if you have sociological studies, they're good parents. So these myths are being promoted. And, you know, as you saw the other night, these myths continue to be promoted through social media and other kinds of things.
We just have 3 minutes. I saw Brian use his hand raised in the front. So maybe, just in the interest of time. Brian, why don't you ask your question quickly?
Sure. My question is basically in the United States, or I guess domestic politics generally, there feels like there's a distance between citizens and domestic issues, and sometimes, you know, on the balance, they're always going to prioritize domestic issues over international issues, where there seems to be an apathy towards the greater international community. What do you think drives that wedge? And also, what can we as citizens, as legal professionals, and as people in, you know, just officers or anyone working in foreign relations, kind of, what can we really do to get through to people if we really think this is important?
Right. Thank you. I think this is now just basic civic understanding. You know, what was Trump's proposal the other night? Tariffs on China. And then the question is, will that raise prices in U.S.? You know, his other big issue is inflation, right? So will imposing more tariffs increase U.S. inflation? And he said, no, it won't. Well, you know, ever since, I mean, just read Paul Krugman and other economists, Stephen Ratner, who's on, you know, Morning Joe, point to the fact that when, you know, washing machines were from China were subjected to tariffs, the price went up by $100. And then when they took the tariffs off, the prices went down. These prices are passed on to consumers. Now that's a domestic, you know, what they call kitchen table issue. But the idea that a presidential candidate of the United States can tell people your problem is going to be solved by tariffs and they're not going to cause inflation, which are two domestic issues you care about, and get away with that is just a sign that, you know, that's what universities are for, which, by the way, is one reason why universities are under attack. They would like to suggest that somehow universities are not places where people are trying to find the truth, and instead make them just another political party. And, you know, I revere universities. My father, Steve's grandfather, you know, when we would go to university, he would say, this would be the greatest university in Korea. Any one of them. He just was so proud that he had come to a place where education and scholarship are so revered. So that's why I'm thrilled to be at BU. That's why I'm thrilled Steve is here. now the third Professor Koh got to teach international law at VU, and I'm very, very pleased. So thank you all very much.